Well, welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast, where we unlock extraordinary minds shaping the future of learning. I'm your host, Charles Good, and today's episode is especially exciting. Our guest is Dr. Daniel Willingham, one of the leading cognitive scientists of our time and a true giant in educational research. Dr. Willingham's groundbreaking studies have revolutionized how millions think about memory, learning, and the brain. He is also the best-selling author of several books, including Why Don't Students Like School and Outsmart Your Brain, bridging the gap between rigorous science and the needs of students, teachers, and lifelong learners everywhere. What really sets him apart is not just his intellect, but his relentless commitment to busting the myths and bringing clarity to a world overwhelmed by misinformation. The practical wisdom that we share today has been adopted by educators globally, changing classrooms and inspiring countless individuals to believe that anyone can learn and learn better. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. Through candid conversations and expert perspectives, we dive into the challenges, breakthroughs, and practical lessons that shape exceptional leadership. Welcome to the program, Dr. Willingham.
Thanks so much. Happy to be here.
So before we dive into the science, let's set the stage on your personal journey. And let's start at the very beginning. What drew you into this fascinating intersection of cognitive science and education?
Well, funnily enough, this was not my vision at all about what I was going to end up doing in my career. I got my Ph.D. In cognitive psychology. I was sort of at the intersection of experimental psychology and neuroscience. So that's like mind and brain. And in particular, I was interested in how the brain changes as learning happens. I actually did not begin my life doing educational research. I started my professional life at the intersection of the study of mind and brain. And in particular, so I was doing basic science. And in particular, I was interested in what changes happen in the brain as we learn. I did that work for about the first 15 years of my career. And at that point, it was actually just a pure chance. There's somebody in the town where I live, Charlottesville, Virginia, who heads up an education nonprofit. And this is a national organization, and they were having their big conference. There were going to be about 500 or 600 teachers at this conference. And he said, you know what, you should come and talk to our teachers about cognitive psychology and how memory works. And I said, I don't know anything about classrooms or education or any of that sort of thing. He said, no, that's okay. That's okay. We get that. We just think the teachers would find it interesting. So, I was like kind of flattered to be asked. So I said, sure, I'll come talk to a bunch of teachers about learning. And then 6 months later, I realized, oh my gosh, I have to give this talk in a couple of weeks. So I had no idea what to do about this. I literally took the course that I had been teaching college sophomores for many years, like the first course you would take in human thinking and learning if you attend college. I took that course and I just picked out some stuff that I thought was kind of interesting and maybe relevant. But I was ready for this talk to be an absolute disaster because I thought, what can I tell teachers about how children learn that teachers don't already know? And I was shocked when the teachers, first of all, didn't know the stuff that I told them, and second, thought it was really relevant to their classrooms. And so that my career changed that afternoon, and I started thinking about how to apply what scientists know about how people learn in classrooms. And I started doing writing and speaking for educators in that vein.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that story. And that connection between research and real world learning is really the core of so much of your work. And on that note, let's talk about learning habits in adulthood, because I find that many adults seem to rely on the same learning practices and habits they used in school. So they haven't updated their learning software, right? Why do you think people rarely update their approach to learning as they get older?
Well, I think there are two reasons. One is they figure, especially someone who is in a career where they're constantly learning new things, this is probably a fairly successful individual. And so they feel like, well, I sort of did okay in school and things didn't go that badly. So it's not obvious to them that they really need to do something about it. And then two, if it were obvious, they don't know what to do. So right? I mean, if someone come along and said, "Hey, listen, what you're doing is it kind of works. Like eventually, the information is getting into your head, but this is really inefficient, and you could definitely save time and effort using other methods." They'd probably be game, but yeah, they don't know about those methods.
Well, and then another dimension really factors into this as well that I've seen in adult learning. They misjudge how well they understand new things. You mentioned two great things about the factors that might lead an adult learner to overestimate their understanding of new material and how they can hopefully then maybe you can unpack how do they overcome this overconfidence.
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of reasons that we all tend to overestimate how much we know. One of the most important is that we don't recognize that we are getting support from the environment, and that is helping our recall. So, one of the most common ways that people try to evaluate whether or not they've learned something, suppose you've got a new software package at the office or something, and you've been studying it and trying to figure it out, and you got the manual in front of you, or on your computer screen, and you're sort of reading it over, and you're like, yeah, 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 right, right, that makes sense, that totally makes sense, and so on. And what you're doing is you're letting the familiarity of the explanation be a guide to whether or not you really have got it locked in your mind. So as you're reading it, you're thinking, this is familiar, this makes sense. And you're sort of implicitly comparing that to the first time you read it, when maybe it didn't really make sense. And so you're right, sort of, that you have learned something. The fact that this now feels familiar, you feel like you understand it better, you are farther along than you were before, but that doesn't mean you actually know it such that when the manual's not open, you'll actually be able to use the software effectively. That's one of the most common and damaging things people do when they're trying to evaluate whether or not they know something.
You're right, that familiarity and partial access to info, which means you have a component of that target material or maybe closely related information, gives you that feeling of knowing without actually knowing it. Meaning, like what you mentioned in your book too, students come to you say, I can't believe I got that wrong. I knew the answer. But when you tell them, okay, well, explain it to me, they can't really state it. They can recollect it, kind of, but not really.
I'll bet your listeners have been that student, right? Where it's like, I know it. And then someone challenges you and says, okay, explain it. And, you say, I know it. I just can't explain it, right? Which you're not totally wrong. Like, there is some knowing there. You know more than you used to, but yeah, you don't know it as well as you did. Now, partial access is a little different. Partial access is the idea that you feel like you know a lot about some topic, and therefore you kind of think you probably know everything. So, for example, if you know a lot about classical music or something, and I say, "Hey, who composed this opera or something," you may think, I can't pull it up at the moment, but like I'm pretty knowledgeable on this subject. And so if I put a little more time into it, I would be able to remember it. Same thing happens with familiarity, actually, that there's that same, if something feels really familiar, that's also a cue. You know what? Even if you can't pull up all the details now, with a little more effort, you'll probably be able to get it later. And that's not completely wrong. Things feeling really familiar or having a lot of expertise on a topic does mean that if, with time, you're a little more likely to be able to remember it, but it's not that reliable that it definitely means you know it.
Let's move into memory. Since memory is such a key to learning, let's tackle some of the widespread misunderstandings. What are some of the most common myths about memory that people have?
Oh God, it's hard to pick. There are some. I mean, probably one of the most common. You probably have something in mind, but I'll mention briefly. One of the most common is learning styles. The idea that different people have different preferred ways of learning. And we were talking before about like when that I had a different area of study before I got into education. And one of the first talks I gave to teachers, I was talking about something else, and I used the idea of learning styles being false as just sort of an example of something. And I took it for granted that everybody in the audience knew that there was no evidence supporting learning styles, and like the atmosphere in the room changed. It's like pitchforks and torches came out. People really hold that idea very dear. So if you're listening and you're thinking like I'm a visual learner, I'm an auditory learner, there's really no scientific backing for that distinction at all. I don't know if that's what you had in mind, or if you had another myth that you were thinking about.
No, that's great. That's one to unpack. Other ones that I was thinking of is, people think of memory as a thing. It does not exist as some thing that can be touched, weighed, or x-rayed. It's usually a kind of a abstraction, right? That refers to a process rather than a structure. So I think even thinking about it that way helps people to understand actually what it is versus just saying, okay, there's this part of my brain that's, serving as my memory, which is not the case.
Yes, because it does. Processing is what it's all about in terms of getting your memory to perform the way you want to. So yeah, thinking about it as a process is I see the usefulness there.
And then, a secret to a good memory, there's just this one secret. And really, there's no single tool that will handle all memory jobs. There's no single secret to a good memory. Memory techniques and systems can serve different tools, right? At different times to do different things.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sometimes asked, what? Yeah, if you had to boil it down to one thing, what would be the advice that you would give? It is tough to come up with, and my usual go-to for that is kind of contingent on the situation and the purpose. And what I advise people to do is think about what it is you anticipate wanting to do with that memory, and then make your studying as similar to that desired situation that's going to come later as you possibly can. So, most of the time, what we want to do is remember what things mean, and so your studying do should in some way prompt you to think about the meaning of the content, which sounds obvious, but like my students all the time, they just sort of mindlessly repeat stuff, or I'll read over my notes, or they'll rewrite their notes. And as you and I know, you can read or write stuff without really thinking about what it means.
And that's such an important thing just to kind of stop on for a second here is think about the meaning. You can't think about all aspects of meaning, but you can think about certain meanings. And that's really what's going to drill it down into your memory. What are you experiencing and thinking about when you're learning this information, when you're reading the book? Make it a more active process because even if you want to remember something, there's no guarantee that you will. And as far as I know, there's no supplements that can really enhance your memory.
Yeah, no, there people have been. I mean, in terms of by supplement, I assume you mean like a vitamin or an herb or something. Yeah, yeah. I mean, people have been looking desperately for that for decades at least, and no one's found anything yet. Yeah, but this thing about this idea that what you want to do is think about what things mean, do active processing. The real challenge there is that the brain doesn't respond very well to that command. The command of like, okay, now really think about this. You can't. So what you need to do is give yourself a concrete task. And so what I'll tell you listeners, what I tell my students, which I think this is totally works for adult learners as well, as when you get to the end of a section of whatever you're reading, stop, look away, and try to summarize what it is you've just finished reading. Some people like to pretend that they're teaching someone else the content. And that does a couple of things. One is it does force you to think when you're producing that summary. The other thing is it gets you to periodically check in with yourself and make sure that you're actually reading and processing and thinking, because as you know, so often, like, you get to the bottom of a page and you suddenly realize, no, I was thinking about lunch, like I was just not focused at all. So having a concrete task to perform where you can only perform the task if you're actually thinking about meaning, that can be very helpful.
Some of the least effective strategies based off of science and research, rereading your notes or book, highlighting, copying those does not guarantee that you're going to think about what the text means. Viewing material several times, right, leads to that illusion of knowing that people think they have it, but it's really that familiarity, but they can't reproduce it. They can't recollect it when they need it. And there's not enough cues to time it in the right direction, right? So that they are cueing the information when they need it.
Yeah, that's a beautiful summary. That's right. That's why all of those very common strategies, the sort of go-to strategies, are not very effective.
And retrieval practice still kind of reigns supreme and just getting that learning to stick. And you mentioned something too that it's somewhat counterintuitive, that continued attempts to retrieve something actually helps you recall it. You actually remember more. So you shouldn't just say, hey, after that first attempt, I don't really understand or recall much of it. Kind of keep progressing with that. And eventually you're going to remember more.
Part of the reason people don't do it is they don't expect it to help. But another reason they don't do it is it's effortful. It's not an easy thing to sit there and really rack your brain and try and generate cues for yourself. So yeah, I mean, it's the kind of advice that I think needs to be measured, because you can't expect people are going to do it all the time. You have to acknowledge that it is effortful. But I think it's very good for people to have that in their back pocket, to at least be making a conscious choice. It's like, okay, I remembered 20% of what I wanted to remember. If I kept after it, I'd probably get another 5%. Now, do I want to keep after it or not? Maybe I want to go back and restudy, or maybe I want to, yeah, sit here and pound at it. But at least you would be making an informed decision.
What really memorizing is only half the battle. Retrieving what you learned is just as critical. And you have some great strategies for retrieving that information. And one of the most common ones is just overlearning. And you give a percentage that you say, try to overlearn material by at least 20%. And there's no scientific basis for that, but at least that kind of sets the marker, the baseline to say, if you really want it to stick and have it accessible to you based on how long you want it accessible to you, you got to overlearn it.
You do. And I mean, forgetting, as you said, I mean, 20% is a made up figure. I tell my students 20%, hoping they'll do 10%. The truth is, like, how much overlearning you would do really depends on how long you want to remember the content. The important thing to keep in mind is that forgetting is very real. Probably until, 10 years ago, researchers thought that forgetting was just this passive thing that happened. Like, the brain can't be perfect, and therefore there's interference, there's some decay, and these other contributors to forgetting. More contemporary theories of memory suggest actually forgetting is a very active process, and you need forgetting in order to sort of make more recent learning more available. So one researcher gave what I think is a vivid analogy of this. Is, if you're on the highway and the speed limit keeps changing, if you want to know what the speed limit is now, it's really helpful if you not only get that speed limit in memory, but the old one is actually scrubbed away. And so that seems to be a very general principle of memory. And that's what you're fighting against. If there's something that you really want to remember, you need to overlearn it initially and then continue to practice it and use it if you want to hold on to it.
Wanting to also talk about just the cramming versus spacing out effect of how that really reinforces memory. And cramming, from what I've seen from the research, you can cram and do well on the test the next day. Where you see the biggest difference is in a week, 2 weeks, maybe a month. The spacing effect has huge advantages because it offers you more cues at different points of time to retrieve that memory, making it more durable.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, that's one hypothesis about why spacing helps so much, is that the content, it becomes associated with these different contexts, and so there's a little more flexibility to the memory. So when you're trying to remember it, of course, in a different context than you studied it, it's been studied in different contexts, and so that's where you get the advantage. Another reason is that forgetting takes place between the spaced practice. And so you're getting sort of the benefit of retrieval practice. You come back to this is another, again, we were talking before about like why people don't like using methods that are really effective. Usually it's because not only are they effortful, but they feel like they're not working. So like, here's this thing you're doing that's harder than the way I usually study. Plus it looks like it's not really working. So when you space study sessions out, if I haven't studied it for 2 days, well, naturally some forgetting has taken place in those 2 days. So now when I come back and study again, I'm like, oh my God, this is not going well. Like, I knew this stuff so well 48 hours ago, but that's actually to your benefit, right? This is going to be effortful. This is going to be an aspect of retrieval practice that's really going to help. So yeah, spacing effect is for exactly the same time investment, you can get more efficient use of your memory simply by spacing out the study sessions.
Well, so speaking of memory, let's discuss some tricks that help us remember details that seem on the surface quite meaningless. And these are the mnemonic devices. What are one or two of the most effective systems you recommend? This should be your last resort for, and this is really for information that you have no architecture for, no schemas, no association, a neural network for yet, or ones that it's really hard to memorize because they don't make meaning. It's hard to make meaning out of those. But give us some examples of those and kind of when they should be used.
Yeah, so I'll just mention in passing that a lot of the memory books that you see for sale on Amazon, so they're written by people who are memory champions. And they are people who compete in memory competitions, and they're really, really good at it. And so they, like, oh, I'll write a book and teach people how to do this. And I point out in my book that this is a memory task that is a very, in these, the things that these people are really good at in these memory competitions are things that you hope you never have to become good at, because the people who design these memory competitions are very aware of the fact that things you already know about what you're trying to learn make it easier or more difficult to learn the new content. So I think I give the example in the book. Suppose that we're trying to have a memory competition. I have 10 people who come in and I say, you've got an hour to memorize as much of this F. Scott Fitzgerald novel as you can, This Side of Paradise. Well, obviously, someone who's read the book before is at an advantage, right? And so, because the people who set up memory competitions are aware of this, they give people memory tasks where no one can possibly know anything about the content to be memorized. So, it's something like they'll take a deck of cards, they'll shuffle it, and then you have to memorize the order of the cards. So this is completely meaningless content. And mnemonics are the main way that memory champions succeed in memory tasks like this. So one of the best known techniques is the memory palace, where you take, most people will use like a walk, that it has to be spatial. You take a walk that is already very familiar to you. So it might be like, I go out my front door and the first station is my front porch, and there's a pillar that needs to be repaired. And then I walk down my driveway and I look at my pear tree, which is kind of not looking very well, but sick, and so on. So what you do is you have these stations in your walk that are going to be cues. And so the first is the broken pillar. And so whatever it is you're trying to memorize becomes associated with the broken pillar. The next thing is going to be the pear tree that looks sickly, and I associate item number 2 with the pear tree. This is a very effective way of committing information to memory that's meaningless, because it uses visual mental imagery. And that's helpful for reasons we could go into. It only works for certain types of content. If it's content that's difficult to create visual mental images of, then the memory palace is not going to be very successful. And again, I'll repeat what you said. Like, this is your last resort. If you possibly can, make the content meaningful, and it's going to be there are other techniques I would use. But if you're stuck, then memory palace is a good way to go.
Well, I like what you said too, because some of the insights from memory champions and these memory books you can use to help your memory. So, imagery, visual imagery, creating an image when you can, a concrete representation of what you want to store in memory is so much more effective. It sticks better. Emotions, if you can have strong emotional events, have been shown to increase the memory of certain things and associate images with the message. You're tying those to what you already know, to what you need to know. So, I think there's some fundamental principles that kind of overlap, but you're right. It requires a lot more preparation, right? And a lot more work to get these in place.
Yeah, you have to memorize your walk. I mean, the other thing is, not everything that you want to remember is really well susceptible to images. And some things that you try and create an image of, the images are ambiguous. So, like, if you're trying to remember the concept democracy, and you're like, someone voting, the Capitol Dome, like, what do I do? Like, whatever you come up with is maybe not going to be so clear to you later. And Imagery is really especially good when you're trying to remember what things look like, right? This sort of follows this principle I was talking about before. How are you going to want to remember it later? If you want to remember what something looks like, then imagery is the way to go. If you want to remember what it means, don't create a picture of it in your mind. Think about what it means.
I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.